In this session, we are going to speak about dates. As you see, I've prepared for you a small sheet in which we can go through all the dates functions that are useful in Excel. First and foremost, I want to state that Excel accepts dates in the range between 1st January 1900 and up to 31st December 9999. So the first function we are going to look at is the date function, which returns the number that represents the date in Microsoft Excel format. So as you might remember from the previous video, Excel understands dates as numbers. So the syntax for this function is date, and then I can plug in as suggested year, month, and day. And what Excel does with this function is it automatically converts the plugged in values to numbers representing dates. So if I switch here to number, you can see all those dates are number values. As said, for dates over 9,999, so starting from 1st January 10,000, it will return an error. However, an interesting thing happens when you plug in a date pre 1st January 1900. So let's go for 1898. And if you plug that date, you will see that Excel actually miscalculates it. This is an important factor, an important thing to remember as you're working with dates. So the next interesting thing I can show you is what happens when you plug in the number of months exceeding 12 months to a correct date. So for example, let's plug in 36 months. And as you can see, the date function automatically calculates the date adding 36 months to the year requested. So in our case, it would be 2 full years because we have the entire 2024, then the additional 2 years, so 2025 and 26. The same thing happens if you plug in an excess number of days. So for example, let's plug in here 50 days. What Excel will do is it will automatically add the days to reflect the date. So the next function we will look at is Datevalue. Datevalue converts a date from text to a number that represents the date in the Microsoft Excel code. So to use this function, you just simply type in date value and plug in the date as text. And this is the proof of what I said before, so that Excel understands dates as numbers, because if you switch those numbers to dates in the short or in the long date format, it will return the corresponding dates. However, if you try to switch those text stored dates to numbers, nothing will happen. Right, so as you can see, in cases in which the date is not a correct recognizable date or a date preceding the year 1900, this date value function will return an error. Now let's see what will happen if we go with the date 10,000. The same thing as in case of the other unrecognizable dates, so Excel will throw a value. The third function allows you to calculate the number of months either after or before the requested date. So the function is Edate, and the syntax for this function is Edate. You plug in the start date, and then you plug in the number of months. So the interesting thing here is, of course, when we use an incorrect date, it will return an error, a hash value. But the interesting thing here is that it both takes positive and negative values, as well as 0, in case of which nothing happens, right? And now let's go to the most interesting function of all of those. It's a kind of a hidden function. It's Datedif. So whenever I type Datedif, as you can see, Excel won't automatically fill in the function, but when I open the bracket, it recognizes it as a function. So this function returns the specific number of months, days, years, or according to the parameter between the requested two dates. So the parameters for this function are start date, end date, and the parameter indicating on what we want to calculate. So in case of this function, the key is that, for example, for the parameter y, m, and d, it returns, so for y and m, it returns the number of complete years and months. And for the number of days, we will see the calculation in a second. So for example, if I change the year here to 2024, Excel will return 0 as it doesn't calculate this in a decimal format. So since the full year didn't pass, it recognizes it as 0. Same thing here. So for example, if you have a difference between the 1st and 31st, Excel will calculate is as 2 months, right? Because the day for the first date is the 1st. If I would change that to 1st April, however, it would calculate 3 months. For the days, Excel does quite a good calculation. So let's change here the date to the 1st. And as you can see, the first day, as in the previous cases, gets omitted. So same as in the months cases. This is important for Excel calculations as you might want to add that missing day. Next parameter is MD, which actually allows you to ignore months and years. So what it does is it calculates the number of days between the day in the first date and the day in the second date. And once again, as above, you might want to add an additional day. So for example, if I go 1, it will calculate 0 because it omits the starting day as those days are equal. The YN parameter allows you to ignore days and years, so it calculates only the difference in months. As previously said, it will ignore the first month, so you might want to remember to add an additional 1 month if you're calculating something for your purposes. The third parameter calculates the days numbers between two dates, utilizing only the day and the month. So now let's go to an Excel trick and look at multiplying by 1. What this does is it forces Excel to try to convert a date stored in text to a number. It isn't a function, however, the syntax is you just point to a cell or just provide it a date as text and then multiply it by 1. As in previous examples, dates that are either fictitious or are out of the scope of Excel will return an error. And finally, we get to the text function, which is not strictly a date function, but it allows us to manipulate dates. So the syntax in this case would be text, then we plug in the value, and then we plug in the format that we want to achieve. And as you'll see, if I drag the formula, Excel will automatically apply the format that I require to those dates. An important thing here is you can notice I've distinguished months from minutes, as this is the full date time format. Of course, as in case of any other function, I can either use values stored in cells, or I can plug in those values, those parameters as text. So for example, if I took this value and plugged it in as text without the apostrophe, of course, and then I would take the parameter, the format, and plugged it in as text, it will do the calculation. And that goes for all the functions that you've seen so far. So, hope this session was helpful. Have a great day and see you in the next session.